Imagine believing your badge makes you invincible, untouchable. Officer Dan Harris thought he could get away with anything, using his power to control, intimidate, and break the law. But one woman, with nothing but the truth on her side, changed everything. This is the story of how the system was brought to its knees, and how justice finally prevailed. You won't want to miss this. The courtroom was quiet. The usual hum of hushed whispers, the shuffle of papers, and the sound of shoes echoing against the floor all seemed to fade into the background. The eyes of everyone present were drawn to him, the officer in uniform, seated confidently at the defense table. His face wore an arrogant smirk, as though he knew he had already won. Officer Dan Harris was used to walking into any room and commanding respect. But today was different. Today, the room was filled not just with tension, but with something much more dangerous for him, the possibility of exposure. For years, Dan had relied on the unshakable power of his badge. To him, that badge wasn't just a symbol of law enforcement. It was a shield, one that made him untouchable. It granted him the freedom to bend the rules, make the laws work in his favor, and walk away from any situation unscathed. He believed he could get away with anything. He had done so countless times before. When someone dared to challenge him, his colleagues closed ranks, and the system, which should have been his check, became his protector instead. Dan Harris had made a career out of pushing boundaries, of using his authority for personal gain, believing he was above the law. His arrogance had led him to take advantage of his power in ways that most could only imagine. But that all changed on one routine shift. It started innocently enough. A minor arrest, a woman in the wrong place at the wrong time. Dan had no idea that this simple encounter would set off a chain of events that would not only bring his actions into the light, but would also bring him face to face with the very justice he had long evaded. That woman, Claire Reynolds, was about to change everything. Her name was Claire Reynolds, a woman who had made it her life's mission to stand up for what was right, no matter the cost. Unlike so many others who had fallen victim to the oppressive weight of the system, Claire wasn't afraid. She knew that fear was a tool used by those in power to control and silence people like her. And she had seen enough injustice in her own life to understand exactly how the system worked to protect the guilty. On that fateful day, Claire had no idea that a simple traffic stop would turn into a fight for her rights, and ultimately, her freedom. It all started with a minor paperwork error, nothing that couldn't be cleared up with a simple explanation. But Officer Dan Harris, with his usual air of superiority, saw it as an opportunity to escalate things. He could have given her a warning, let her go, and moved on with his day. But no, his ego got the better of him. The moment Claire tried to explain herself, she could feel it, the shift in his demeanor. His tone grew cold, his words harsh, as if her mere presence had offended him. She knew something wasn't right, but she hadn't expected what came next. Without warning, Dan arrested her on trumped-up charges that made no sense at all. It was clear, he wasn't just doing his job, he was abusing his power. But Claire wasn't one to back down. She wasn't going to let this officer, or anyone, else use their authority to trample on her rights. As soon as she was released, she called her lawyer, started gathering evidence, and began preparing for the battle ahead. Claire wasn't just fighting for herself. She was fighting for anyone who had ever been crushed under the weight of a corrupt system. Vanessa Grant, Claire's lawyer, was a force to be reckoned with. Known for her no-nonsense approach to high-profile cases, Vanessa had built a reputation for taking down even the most untouchable individuals.
She had faced the kind of powerful opponents that most lawyers wouldn't dare to challenge. And yet, she had a knack for finding cracks in their seemingly impenetrable defenses. She knew this case would be different. Officer Dan Harris wasn't
just any defendant. He represented the very system that had allowed corruption and abuse of power to go unchecked for years. Taking him on meant not just fighting a single man, but the institution that had backed him for so long. The odds were stacked against Claire, but Vanessa wasn't the type to back down from a challenge. The first days of the trial were a pressure cooker of tension. Dan sat in the courtroom like he owned the place, his posture rigid with arrogance. He often turned to look at Claire, a smirk plastered across his face as if daring her to think she could win. His confidence was unshakable. After all, he had gotten away with far worse for years. But as the trial unfolded, it was becoming clear that things weren't going according to his plan. Vanessa's team was thorough. They had gathered every possible piece of evidence to build their case, from witnesses who had seen the entire traffic stop unfold to security footage that contradicted Dan's version of events. Each new piece of evidence chipped away at Dan's defense. And then came Claire's testimony, calm, composed, and unwavering. It was clear that she wasn't going to back down no matter what Dan threw her way. With each passing day, the case against him became more irrefutable. But the real turning point came when Vanessa called on a surprise witness, an unexpected ally from within the police force itself, a former colleague of Dan's, someone who had witnessed firsthand the abuse of power that Dan had carried out for years. This officer, a man named Kevin Shaw, had left the force years ago after witnessing too many unethical actions, including the very behavior Claire had been subjected to. For years, Kevin had stayed silent, afraid of the consequences of speaking out. But now, with the walls closing in on Dan, Kevin found the courage to tell the truth. His testimony was the nail in the coffin, revealing a pattern of corruption and abuse that went far beyond Claire's case. Dan's smug demeanor began to crack, the walls of invincibility he had so carefully built around himself crumbling with every word Kevin spoke. It was clear now. The system Dan had relied on to protect him was starting to turn against him, and his downfall was imminent. The moment Kevin Shaw, the former officer, took the stand, the courtroom seemed to hold its breath. The tension was palpable. Everyone knew this was the turning point, the moment that could either make or break the case. As Kevin began his testimony, the weight of his words hung heavy in the air. He spoke with an unwavering clarity that left no room for doubt. With each incident he described, each abuse of power, each manipulation of the law, it became painfully obvious that Dan Harris's reign of arrogance wasn't just an isolated event. It was a pattern, a dangerous pattern that had gone unchecked for years. The gasps from the courtroom were unmistakable. It was one thing for a civilian like Claire to accuse an officer, but it was an entirely different story when one of Dan's own colleagues came forward, revealing the full extent of his misconduct. The defense scrambled to discredit Kevin, attacking his character and trying to undermine his credibility. But it was too late. The damage had been done. The jury, the judge, and everyone in that room could see the truth. Dan Harris wasn't just a bad apple. He was part of a rotten system that had allowed him to get away with years of abuse. As the trial continued, Dan's facade began to crumble. His usual confidence turned to unease, his cocky smirk replaced by nervous glances toward the defense table. The very thing he had relied on, his badge, was now the very thing that was being used to expose him. The lies he had carefully crafted were slowly being unraveled before the eyes of the judge, the jury, and the spectators who had gathered to witness the trial. Finally, the moment came for Vanessa Grant to deliver the prosecution's closing statement. Her voice rang out with unwavering conviction, commanding the room's attention. She painted a vivid picture of Dan as a man who had exploited his position for personal gain, a man who had violated the laws he swore to uphold. She didn't just describe a single incident or a random mistake. She spoke of a man who had used his power to manipulate and harm those who had no voice. With the weight of Kevin's testimony behind her, Vanessa's words felt like a call to justice. She made one final argument that echoed through the courtroom. No one, no matter how powerful, should be allowed to escape justice simply because they wore a uniform. It was a simple truth, but one that resonated deeply. Dan had thought that his badge made him untouchable, but in that moment, the power of the law was the very thing that was closing in on him. The verdict was still to come, but it was clear to everyone present that Dan Harris's days of walking free were numbered. The moment the verdict was read, the courtroom seemed to hold its breath. The judge's voice rang out, declaring Dan Harris guilty on all charges: misconduct, abuse of power, and unlawful arrest. The weight of those words was not just the end of the trial. It was the final nail in the coffin for a man who had believed his badge would protect him forever. For a few brief seconds, there was stunned silence. But then, as if a dam had burst, the courtroom erupted into applause. It was a rare, powerful moment in a justice system that often protected its own. In that one overwhelming display of support, the people in that room sent a message. Even those in power must answer for their actions. Claire, sitting quietly among the crowd, felt the relief wash over her like a wave. It wasn't just the sweet taste of victory she savored. It was something deeper. She had done it. She had brought down a man who thought he was untouchable, a man who believed he could walk free despite his abuses. As the courtroom noise buzzed around her, Claire's mind was calm. She had faced the system, stared down corruption, and come out on top. It wasn't just a legal battle she had won. It was a victory for all those who had ever been mistreated by those in positions of power. For Dan Harris, The consequences were swift and unforgiving. The justice system that had so often shielded him turned its back, stripping him of his badge, his career, and any shred of respect he once held. His reputation was in tatters. The fear and intimidation he had once used to control the streets were no longer his to wield. The world he had so carefully constructed around his position of power now crumbled at his feet. But for Claire, the victory was more than personal. It was a message for everyone who had ever been silenced by authority, for those who had felt powerless in the face of injustice. Claire had shown them all that standing up for what's right, no matter the cost, could bring even the most powerful down to their knees. It wasn't just her triumph. It was the triumph of everyone who dared to challenge the system, to fight for truth, and to believe that justice could prevail, even when it seemed out of reach. As Claire's victory echoed through the courtroom, it became clear that no one, no matter how powerful, is truly untouchable. This story isn't just about a woman taking down a corrupt officer. It's about the power of standing up for what's right, even when the odds seem impossible. It's a reminder to all of us that justice can prevail, and that we each have the power to make a difference, no matter the challenges. So, if you were inspired by Claire's courage and the way she fought against all odds, don't let this moment pass by. Hit that subscribe button now to keep up with more incredible stories like this one. Don't forget to give this video a thumbs up and share it with your friends to spread the message that justice matters. Your support means the world, and it helps us bring more amazing content straight to you. Thanks for watching, and remember, standing up for what's right can change everything. See you in the next video.